Like to talk for just a few minutes about how money works, and particularly how it works in our American system, and how we've all been victimized for at least a century and more, and quite possibly going back quite a ways before that. And this is not unique to the United States. Um, Most of the world is has been victimized by a central banking system, meaning that their monetary systems are not controlled by governments, let alone by governments representing the people, but by a private banking cabal or cartel. So let me start by saying that our Federal Reserve System is neither federal nor does it have any reserves. This goes back to at least 1913. Uh, a few years before that, the United States was going through an economic crisis where the banks were running out of money and people were demanding their deposits, and we were in a what you might call a recession or a depression. Whether it was real or manipulated, I frankly don't know. I haven't studied it in detail that far back, but this goes back to about 1907, I believe. J.P. Morgan, probably the largest banker in the United States at the time, pulled together a number of his cronies, and they got on a private train incognito, and they went down to a place in Arkansas called Jekyll Island, where they had a meeting on how to, well, the official narrative is how to save the system and the economic system. The uh, the result of that meeting was a bailout of the United States monetary system by privately funding private banks through the US government. The people that provided those funds were J.P. Morgan and his banking colleagues. This led to their pressing for and ultimately achieving in 1913 the Federal Reserve Act, which was passed on December 22nd, 1913, when most of Congress had left the city for Christmas vacation, and it was then signed into law on December 23rd, 1913. What this provides for is turning our monetary system over to private bankers, a central banking system, which we labeled the Federal Reserve System. But it's not a governmental arm, it's private bankers. And the way the system works is those banks issue credit to the United States government. Our government then signs IOUs agreeing to pay that money, that credit back with interest to the private bankers. The bankers use that interest to buy commodities, businesses, farmland, real estate, politicians. This has been going on for over 100 years. It used to be that our money was backed by gold reserves, and made a big deal about all that gold being held in Fort Knox. Fort Knox has never been audited. We don't know if there's any gold left there. We were removed from the gold standard in the 1970s by Richard Nixon, and then what backed our money theoretically was the agreement of the oil-producing nations to trade their oil for American currency. It had no other value other than the value assigned by people who trusted that it did have value by trading in those dollars. And the way the system works is the bankers issue credit to the United States government. The government agrees to pay that back with interest. and then prints money, which the Federal Reserve disperses to various banks and entities. That money no longer has any backing at all to it. And we were operating on what was called a fractional reserve system, where banks were required to at least maintain a percentage of physical cash in their banks against people wanting to withdraw money. That system is broken down. There's nothing backing our money anymore. And what's happening is the private bankers issue our government credit. We then spend that money, but we give IOUs back to the bankers to repay it with interest. We then do two things with it. We print currency, which is not real money, it's currency, and there's a difference. And we then issue treasury bonds, which entities buy from our government also in exchange for getting interest back on that. And that's how we repay the bankers what they lent us, which was actually nothing. All it is numbers on a ledger sheet. So this money is being multiplied every time it changes hands out of thin air. There's nothing there. It's like my lending you $10, you're agreeing me to pay $11 back, none of which has any value other than the fact that people trust that it has value, so they will trade commodities in it. So I now give you $11 back against the 10 that I borrowed from you. And as a banker, you take the extra dollar and you buy a hard asset with it, which is how they've come to control the world over the last 100+ years. These major corporations and entities of mutual funds where all these assets are piled together, they're owned and controlled by the same few people backed by these bankers. There's nothing behind it. And now the system is on the verge of collapse. We owe more money than we can ever possibly pay. It's in the trillions. And the other nations that have been relying on our currency and agreeing to trade in it finally woke up to the game, and they're abandoning the dollar. There's an alternate economic system in the world now called BRICS. It started out with 4 or 5 nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, developing their own system of exchange and their own economic trading partners and so forth. That entity, BRICS, now has 70 members, representing over 70% of the population of the earth. And virtually every one of those members has now agreed, first, as a first step, not to trade exclusively in US dollars. The next step will be to abandon the US dollar entirely. And I would suggest to you that the people that have been buying our government bonds, which our government sells and pays interest on so that they can pay interest back to the bankers on paper, the entities buying those bonds, particularly other nations like Saudi Arabia and China, are dumping our bonds. When we can no longer sell our debt, we're finished. And we're at that point now. So I'm doing this video strictly to ask people to wake up and recognize what's going on and start preparing for it, because sometime between now and the 2024 election, this is all going to come to a head. The people pulling the strings behind the scenes of our political and economic system cannot afford to lose this next election, and they know it. Patriots, with Trump as a figurehead, also recognize that they can't afford to lose this election. So what we're looking at is total chaos and turmoil between now and November of 2024. The only thing that's going to save the system that we're presently under for these bankers, frankly, is a war. And if you look historically, it's been wars that boosted our economy at every critical juncture. We are desperately trying to go to war now. We tried to trigger a war with Russia in Ukraine. Russia didn't bite. They played rope-a-dope. They went into Ukraine, set up their, took over the Donbass in eastern Ukraine and set up their lines of defense to protect that eastern region, which was Slavic and Russian. And then they let Ukraine punch themselves out. They're not going to be baited into a fight there with the United States directly. We're trying now in the Middle East with the Israeli war against Gaza and the Palestinians, which is turning into genocide. Israel is massacring Palestinians. I support Israel because of the Bible, but I don't support the Israeli government. They're as evil as our own government, and it's time we wake up and recognize what's going on. I've looked at this as far back as 1913, roughly that era where we introduced the Federal Reserve System. My understanding is that the efforts to develop a private banking system, a central banking system, go back almost to our revolutionary days. One of our founding fathers tried to bring in a federal banking system or a private banking system, and he was defeated. In the 1830s, Andrew Jackson defeated the efforts of the private bankers to take over our money. They finally succeeded in 1913. And by the way, the Internal Revenue Service stems from that action as a root, because we have to now tax people to pay the interest on the debt to these private bankers. We're printing money with nothing behind it. There's no backing to it. And as soon as enough people recognize that it's fiat currency, this system will collapse. We're trillions of dollars in debt that we can't pay back. And the only thing that is likely to prolong this system is yet another war where we can crank up the economy and the industrialists and bankers get to make more money and extend their Ponzi scheme for a little while. If you are at all interested in what I have to say here, there's some supporting documentation for this on a website I built at trueheart.net, truhert.net. If you go into the right-hand column on the main page and towards the bottom, there's a link which says how money works. And if you click on that, I've got some videos and background information by other people supporting what I'm saying. There's lots of information out there. And you're not going to get it on the mainstream media, but my reason for posting this is to get people to stand up and wake up and start preparing for an economic collapse that is coming for sure. And it's likely to come between now and our election season of next year, or this year now. So anyway, thanks for watching, and Happy New Year.